Thank you. Wow, great turnout. I thought maybe with the topic that people would shy away from this talk. It isn't something that is very well known, I don't think, unfortunately, and so it's good that there are a lot of people here that are going to hear about this today. So with that as a starting point, and by the way, Don mentioned, in war that war in general is obviously a very ugly situation in terms of mankind. This stuff that you're going to hear about today goes well beyond what I would characterize as anything that you would normally think of in war. So let's see what we got to say. Most of us are familiar with the Nazi human experiments during World War II in the Holocaust. They occurred mostly in death camps, concentration camps like Dachau, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. Victims were estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 30,000 directly subjected to these kinds of experiments. Personnel involved, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 350 doctors were directly involved. The focus was mostly small scale, however. Talk a little bit louder. Can you turn me up a little bit back there? Is that any better? Can you hear me in the back all right? Yeah. Okay, good. The focus was mostly small scale, pseudoscientific, freezing, high altitude. You've probably seen some of those things, pressure chambers, wound healing, sterilization, and twins. Twins in particular were almost a fetish, I guess I would call it, of SS Captain Josef Mengele. Known as the Angel of Death, he performed deadly experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was particularly interested in twins, most of whom were children. He did blood transfusions from one twin to the other, performed amputations, tried to sew it onto the other twin, and stitched two twins together to form Siamese twins. Mengele was also interested in heterochromia, people with different colored irises. He collected eyes and body parts of his victims for research. He injected chemicals into the victims' eyes to try to change their color. He also tried sex change operations, removing organs and operating on victims without anesthesia. Really nice guy. What about the Japanese? Far less known, but believe it or not, far worse. But it wasn't always that way. So back at the time frame of the Russo-Japanese War, which was 1904 to 1905, the history of warfare for centuries had been prolonged campaigns that first or actual enemy kills, meaning 20% were actually on the battlefield, while the other 80% of the casualties were actually taking place as a result of diseases. And the Japanese during this time frame were foremost, actually, in the world in terms of attempting to identify that and do something about it. An Army American doctor who said, I unhesitatingly assert that the greatest conquest of Japan has been in the humanities of war, in the stopping of needless sacrifice of life through preventable disease. That was their attitude or what they were doing, attempting to do at the turn of the 20th century. Unit 731 and its related facilities was the systemic military-scale biological warfare program under the command or the control of the Imperial Army. Victims estimated in range of 200 to 580,000 by comparison to the 15 to 30,000 I just mentioned of the Nazis. Mostly Chinese civilians, some Russians, some Allied POWs, including Americans, and forced laborers through direct biological, chemical, and STD, sexually transmitted disease, thermal and pressure chamber experiments, along with large-scale field biological weapon attack, principally against Chinese civilians. In fact, from 46 to 48, as a result of the release of plague-infected, one of the favorites of the Japanese, bubonic plague animals, as the war was ending, outbreaks of the plague killed an estimated 30,000 people in the area around Harbin. Personnel, compared to the 350 to 250 German, 20,000 doctors, scientists, technicians, and soldiers spread across these units, principally in China. Focus was large-scale experimentation with chemical warfare and biological agents, including plague, anthrax, cholera, typhus, glanders, with the objective of weaponization. Doctors publishing their findings frequently failed to mention that they were conducted on human beings, which we'll get to in a moment. Nazi medical crimes, horrific and cruel, but relatively small. Trial scale, focused on racial ideology, experimental curiosities, and battlefield medicine. By contrast, Unit 731 was industrialized human experimentation, tied directly to Japan's strategic war aims and applied weaponization of disease, with massive civilian deaths through biological warfare. The head of this was a guy by the name of Colonel Shiro Ishii. He was a signatory, and by the way, Japan was a signatory to the Geneva Protocol, which prohibited biological and chemical warfare. Ishii, a specialist in bacterial and related fields, saw this protocol as an opportunity. He reasoned that if something was bad enough to be outlawed, then it must be effective. Ishii began a sustained effort to establish a military arm whose aim it was to develop weapons based on biology. Financial consideration also played a part because it was much less expensive to actually use and deploy chemical weapons or bacterial weapons than it was to cover the cost of maintaining an army and the conventional warfare. By 1930, nationalism was burning hotter than ever in Japan, and it created a climate more receptive to Ishii's ideas developing biological weapons to be used in the conduct of an aggressive war. The Manchurian Incident in 1931, if you might be familiar with that, was a pitched battle between the Japanese and the Chinese forces, which was actually more of a Japanese ruse than anything else. It was used to justify taking over Mukden and then ultimately all of Manchuria. Manchuria is part of modern-day China. It became a perfect place to test Ishii's new bioweapons, where he would be free to conduct any kind of experiments he deemed beneficial. It was under the name of the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, anything but what it really was, which was a biological weapons plant, created to begin with. So this is going on, by the way, from 1932, and as you'll see, all the way until 1945. This is a 13-year-long effort by the Japanese. So it was created in 1932. The laboratory name became, as I said, the perfect disguise for its real purpose. The title of the laboratory was as euphemistic as the Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere banner, under which Japan conquered neighboring countries and murdered millions. I actually talk about this in my talk about my book. Approximately 250,000 people were dying in Japanese-controlled area throughout the entire war, every month. Ishii's goal in turning bacteria and chemical agents into weapons for the Imperial Japanese Army required comprehensive research, and he believed animals had serious limitations in producing usable data. Growing control by Japan over Manchuria provided research materials in the form of people who could be plucked off the streets like lab rats. Unit 731 was extremely well funded with state-of-the-art facilities, generously staffed with the cream of Japanese medical community. The data collected was routinely communicated with the medical establishment back in Japan, including universities. The medical establishment back in Japan even suggested experiments that were regularly received human samples. Specimens include brains, arms, legs, feet, organs, heads, and even whole bodies. The Kempeitai is a military arm of the Imperial Japanese Army from 1881 to 1945. It was not a conventional military force, but more in the line or akin to the the German Gestapo. The U.S. Army estimated that there were over 36,000 members of the Kempeitai, and they were incredibly brutal and notorious in occupied territories like Manchuria. This organization was widely used by Unit 731 to procure human specimens. The Japanese built their first facilities in the Manchurian city of Harbin in 1932 after its fall, an area of about 500 meters squared. Designed as a restricted military zone, it was about 62 acres in size. By the way, I'm having a little bit of a frog in my throat. Can I get a bottle of water or something, or a glass of water? Somebody? An additional tract of land to the south of the zone was also forcibly appropriated and made into a Japanese military airport for use by 731 to transport things back and forth between Japan proper, obviously, and the facility. By 1936, it was well known among the Chinese that this was not just a prison, but a production facility for bacterial and chemical weapons, and it had become a murder shop. Precipitated by an escape of 40 prisoners, the Harbin facilities were closed and moved to Pingfang in 1936, about 15 miles away, with even greater security and scale. Thank you. Let me take a quick drink of that. And according to this lieutenant general, the medical service of the former chief of the medical administration for the Kwantung Army. Kwantung Army was a huge Japanese army that was in Manchuria throughout this period of time, all the way until the end of the war. Scale-wise, in the neighborhood of 800,000 men, so a very large unit, gradually diminished over the course of the war as they took more and more of the units to fight the Americans in the Pacific. Ishii was given permission to begin the Pingfang experiment in 1936 by, guess who? The command of the emperor. Pingfang complex grew into a sprawling walled city of more than 150 buildings, and its base perimeter incorporated more than 2.3 square miles and rivaled Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is not small scale. Prison blocks in Pingfang served the same purposes as cages for guinea pigs in conventional laboratories. Its factories could produce 30 kilograms, 66 pounds of bubonic plague, that was one of their favorites, as I mentioned before, bacteria in a few days. It had 4,500 containers to raise fleas, that's what that carried the plague, and 1,800 large containers to produce biological agents. Sometime between 39 and 40, the aforementioned Lieutenant General I won't try to pronounce that, stated that Hirohito issued a decree recognizing the service of Ishii's detachment. So the emperor was involved in helping it get formed in the first place, and along the way was commending the development and the efforts of the unit. Hirohito's younger brother, Prince Takashito, toured Unit 731 in 1945. Thus, from 36 until literally the end of the war, the emperor was directly involved or had knowledge of, commended their efforts. Pingfang was equipped for disposing of its consumed human lab material with 3 large incinerators, much the same the way that the Nazis did. Here's where it starts to get really gruesome. Vivisection is the practice of performing operations on live animals, in this case, humans, for the purpose of experimentation or scientific research. In a gruesome professionalism that built the legacy of Unit 731, there was one touch of sardonic humor. As the massive Pingfang installation was under construction, local people began to ask what it was. The glib answer supplied was that the Japanese were building a lumber mill. Regarding this reply, one of the researchers joked privately, and the people are the logs. Maruta is the Japanese word for log. From then on, the Japanese term maruta was used to speak of the prisoners whose last days were spent being torn apart, frozen, gassed by Japanese medical professionals. And no one escaped, not men, women, children, even infants, and the unborn. The life expectancy was about 1 month. One exception, pregnant women. The doctors wanted to observe the effects of their experiments on the unborn, so they would allow the pregnancy to go on for a longer period of time than 1 month. Japanese doctors believed that by using humans, their tests would be more valid in the creation of weapons. In a supreme act of racial arrogance, the conviction was basically that the use of humans, not of their race, was of no more consequence than using laboratory rats. Did I lose my... Wow. Oh, somehow it went to a black screen for me up here anyway. The research methods in Manchuria allowed doctors to induce diseases and examine the effects on organs in the first stages. As soon as the symptoms, after someone had been injected with one of these diseases or exposed to one of these diseases, were observed, a prisoner was taken from their cell and into the dissection room. He was stripped and placed on a table screaming, trying to fight back. He was strapped down, still screaming, frightfully. One of the doctors stuffed a towel in his mouth, and then with one quick slice of a scalpel, the victim was opened up. Even with the intestines and organs exposed, the victim did not die immediately. A doctor at Pingfang testified of a time when he was working on a woman who had awakened from the anesthesia. They weren't always given anesthesia. Frequently, these were performed without anesthesia. While being vivisected, the woman said, "It's all right to kill me, but please spare my child's life." The child was not spared. The doctors wanted their data. There are also accounts of experiments being carried out on mothers and their children. High-pressure gas chambers was one of the venues for these tests. Vivisection was also used by imperial doctors to help them train as doctors in dealing with battlefield wounds. Surgery began. This is an example. The man was given ether and dissected. His appendix was so small it was like looking for a burrowing worm. I had to cut and search repeatedly. The blood flow was stopped, nerves were cut, bones were cut with a saw, and a tracheotomy was performed. Blood and air escaped from his body, and blood came foaming up. Practice time, 2 hours. The man died, and the body was thrown in a hole and buried. 3,000 is considered an extremely low number of the people who were victims of vivisection. Some historians believe the number was closer to 12,000. A B-29 captured crew were vivisected by Japanese doctor at Kyushu University, not in Manchuria. Some of these doctors were charged with war crimes after the war. I actually interviewed Dr. Ito that lived up in Arvada 10, 15 years ago, one of the first guys I interviewed for the Veterans History Project. And he served as an interpreter after the war on war crimes trials. And he served on a trial that was for vivisection in Japan. Testing. Victims were injected with various biological agents, including plague, typhus, cholera, blenders, anthrax, and STDs. People were also tied to stakes to find the best range for conventional weapons, flamethrowers, grenades, bombs, chemical weapons, and mustard gas, biological plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. Victims were positioned at different angles and distances to determine the appropriate kill radius. Various bacterial agents were sprayed on nearby communities in large field tests. Communities' water and food supply or sources were also contaminated in another form of field testing. People were locked in high-pressure chambers until their eyes popped out and were put in centrifuges and spun to death like a cat in a washing machine. Other experiments included or involved hanging prisoners upside down to discover how long it took them to choke to death, and injecting air in their arteries to test the onset of embolisms. Another test consisted of taking blood samples. At least one pint was drawn at 2 to 3 day intervals. Some of the victims became progressively debilitated and wasted. Still, the blood drainage continued. Not every victim was drained to the point of death. Many were injected with poison when they could no longer serve as lab material. Sometimes when a subject was too weak to offer physical resistance, the victim was killed with a blow to the head with an axe. The brain might then be used for further research. Electrical shocks were administered until the person slowly roasted to death. Tests which would have a genuine medical value, such as finding the best treatment for frostbite, were achieved by gratuitously cruel means. In below freezing temperatures, victims were tied up outside with their arms and feet bared and soaked with water. Other testing including transfusing the wrong blood type and blood from animals, injections of seawater, prolonged X-ray exposure. As noted previously, the research was made available to not just the members of Unit 731, but to doctors and educators throughout Japan. In this way, 731 was performing a service of human experimentation for the entire Japanese medical community in an ongoing feedback loop. Medicine itself must become a weapon. The scale comes into sharper focus when we look at the breadth of the organization the organization is considered. In addition to the Pingfang main facility, there were also facilities in 9 other major cities, field testing in 3 other locations, and these were the other units that were part of the Unit 731, spread throughout China. The total number of personnel involved in Unit 731 was 20,000. All units and facilities were coordinated by the Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory under Colonel Ishii, later to become General Ishii. In 1938 to 1939, so now we move to how were they planning to use these things. This wasn't just an idle experiment to see if we could actually create these weapons. Let's see if we can actually use these weapons. So the first opportunity came in 1938-39. The Soviet and the Japanese armies clashed in a full-scale encounters along the, I'm not going to try to pronounce that border, but basically it was the border between Manchuria and Russia. In 1939, the battle known as the Nomenon Incident resulted in an overwhelming defeat of the Japanese forces. However, it did provide an opportunity for 731 to attempt to use one of their biological weapons by dumping it into the water. The Japanese dumped large quantities of intestinal typhoid bacteria into a river. Fortunately for the Russians, this type of typhoid germ became ineffective almost immediately upon being dumped. It was done probably simply because they wanted the publicity of, hey, we've tried it. You know, you've been doing this for years for the Japanese army. Now we want to prove that we actually had a trial, even if it didn't succeed. In 1940, the Japanese attacked Ningbo in China with plague, mixed with wheat, corn, cloth scraps, and cotton, and then dropped it from the air. These attacks were carried out by slow, low-flying planes against unarmed villages. More than 100 people died within a few days of the attack. In 1942, the Japanese conducted a second attack. In this particular case, this was another favorite thing of theirs in terms of how they would use vivisection. The doctors literally set up a house on the top of the hill about 1 kilometer away from where the attack had taken place. Infected members of the community after the attack were brought to the laboratory and, of course, vivisected. The area remained closed until the 1960s. During the Battle of Bataan in the Philippines in March of 1942, the Japanese planned to release 200 pounds of plague-carrying fleas, about 150 million insects in 10 separate attacks. It is unknown why the attacks didn't actually take place. During the June-July 1944 Battle of Saipan, plague-infested fleas were again to be used against U.S. forces. However, the Japanese submarine carrying the fleas was sunk by another American submarine.
Good for that.
Yeah. On Iwo Jima, February-March of 45, another biological attack was to be conducted against the invading Americans. 2 gliders carrying pathogens were to be towed over the battlefield and released. The gliders never reached their destination, fortunately. And during the Battle of Okinawa, from April to June of 1945, Ishii's organization had developed plans to meet the American invaders with plague bacteria. Fortunately, Unit 730 was unable to deliver the bombs to the battlefield. The native Okinawan population never knew about this plan until 1994. Okinawa was part of Japan. And to give you some idea of how important they placed life in general, apparently in none of these planned attacks was there any consideration given to the Japanese troops, or in this case, Japanese civilians in the case of Okinawa, that they were going to be infected as well. We're still not done. Operation PX, aka Cherry Blossoms at Night, was the code name for the Japanese plan for a biological terror attack on the U.S. homeland. The operational plan, completed March 26, 1945, was abandoned due to the strong opposition of General Imezu, Army Chief of Staff, a member of Prime Minister Suzuki's war cabinet at the end of the war, called the Big Six. The plan for the attack involved Sarin aircraft, launched from I-400 submarine aircraft carriers, the largest submarine produced by anybody during the course of the war. These things actually had, here up in the front, let me point to this. This area right up here was actually a small hangar underneath here, and you could actually launch it was either 2 or 3 of these little aircraft from the deck of the submarine once it was obviously on the surface. The planes were supposed to spread weaponized bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and dengue. I think that's how it's pronounced. Fever? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah.
Gotcha. San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The planes were to spread the bubonic plague. Oh, there we go. Even the submarine crews were to infect themselves and in a suicide mission and run ashore to try to infect people. Records uncovered, maybe somebody's heard of this. Actually, a couple of these landed in Colorado. Records uncovered in the Japanese war and Japan after the war indicate that about 9,000 paper, those balloons are made out of paper balloons, were launched during this period from November 44 to April 45 and landed, a couple hundred at least, maybe 1,000 landed in the United States. Before Japan surrendered, Ishii and the Army leaders proposed using balloon bombs carrying loaded cattle plague and anthrax in the U.S. The ones that they did launch that actually reached the United States had conventional weapons on them. And in fact, one of them actually was found by, I think, about 6 people up in Oregon who apparently screwed around with it to the point where it exploded and killed them. Those were the only casualties. The United States did a great job relative to these balloon balls of putting a cap, so to speak, on all the publicity associated with it. And because the Japanese were not getting any feedback indicating that they were actually reaching the United States, they were launched from Japan. The expectation was they would get into the jet stream and then eventually flow over the United States and fall, okay? But we did such a great job of capping any publicity associated with these, the Japanese ultimately thought that it had been a failure. But as you see, the intent was using these ultimately biological weapons and send those into the United States. Okay. And finally, in the occupation of Japan, a final use of the biological weapons was considered just about the time the Japanese surrendered. Ishii wanted to stage a suicide germ attack against U.S. occupying troops in Japan. The attack never took place due to the opposition from, again, Imezu and Kawabe, who did not want Ishii to die in a suicide attack. That was their biggest concern, and asked him instead to wait for the next opportunity. This is after the occupation has occurred, surrender, occupation. General Ishii and those under his command were given immunity from prosecution as war criminals in return for Unit 731's research. Hard to believe, after what we've just heard, that these guys were given immunity. The deal was recommended by Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, so Ishii's in the far left corner there, and Sanders is the next guy. MacArthur and Truman approved it. From start to finish, the highest levels of the Japanese government and military were involved in Unit 731. Hideki Tojo, head of the Kenpeitai in Manchuria, and from 35 to 37 became Japan's longest-serving prime minister in World War II, from October 18th of 41 until July 22nd of 44. Tojo was approved the attack on Pearl Harbor, was tried as a Class A war criminal and hanged in 1948. General Umezu, who served, Chief of the Army Chief of Staff, was a member of the elite war cabinet of the Big Six that held the reins of power in Japan from April of 45 until they surrendered the armed forces of the United States, or the Allies, in 1945. He had directed the oversight of Unit 731 as head of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria from 39 to 44. He was tried as a Class A war criminal and sentenced to life in prison. Somebody was asking about war crimes trials in Japan. Yes, they did happen. Emperor Hirohito approved the plans of building the Pingfang facility in 36, commended the unit Unit 731 for its service and accomplishments, and his brother visited the facility in 45. So he knew of it from the very beginning and all the way until the end. In 1998, more than 100 Chinese plaintiffs filed suit in Japan in an effort to get the Japanese government to acknowledge crimes of Unit 731 and to obtain reparations for the victims of their families. Mere months before the trial began, the Japanese Educational Ministry approved a textbook glossing over the Imperial Japanese Army's culpability. The Tokyo District Court's ruling, coming on August 28th of 2002, accepted that Unit 731 had waged germ warfare in China and caused harm to residents, but dismissed the Chinese plaintiffs' claim for compensation. Nevertheless, it was the first time the Japanese court admitted that the Imperial Army had used biological weapons during the war with China from 32 to 45. Judge Iwata said in handing down his ruling, "The evidence shows that Japanese troops, including those from Unit 731, used biological weapons under the order of the Imperial Japanese Army's headquarters, and that many, many, many local people died." Noteworthy in the judge's declaration was his gross understatement of many local residents died. Unit 731's legacy is one of a macabre indulgence born of racist Japanese culture that ruthlessly exploited anyone under its control in useless, fiendish, and sadistic experiments. This is my quote, by the way, and that in the end accomplished nothing militarily. Oh, so staying on that point, so we bought that research, right, from them and gave them amnesty. It was worthless in terms of our own biological. Shortly after, obviously, World War II ended, both the Americans and the Russians began seriously in biological weapons development, which is part of the reason that we decided that we wanted that information. Turned out to be worthless. So for all the experimentation on human beings that the Japanese did, that research absolutely did nothing. And there's the book that John mentioned earlier or whatever. This is my book, 140 Days to Hiroshima, in case anybody's interested. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Did the U.S. have any inclination during this time that was going on? No.
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I've come across. I will say this, just in general, when I was doing this, and I originally did the research for an article actually that I wrote in World War II Quarterly that Flint over there ultimately published. There is not a huge amount of material on the subject, and it was really difficult, frankly, writing that article. I mean, you get into some of the stuff that we've obviously been covering this morning, and it's like, this is really hard to actually look at and read and think about what was going on. So not a lot. So I did not, in terms of the research that I was doing, I never uncovered that we knew about it during the course of the war.
Another question.
Yeah.
Did
Just a second.
Japan have any women doctors?
I didn't, I mean, you saw in those pictures that there were women, they were there. I don't know really whether any of those were doctors or whether they were nurses or other type of medical personnel.
But there were women involved?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if you remember that one picture I showed, quite a few. There were 20,000 altogether, so obviously I didn't show you 20,000. But that one picture showed you a pretty good cross-section of men and women there, so yes. Yeah. John?
Oh, yeah, a couple things. One, I had a Japanese exchange student who I'm still corresponding with when she comes visit us. We go to visit her. I brought her through the museum, even showing her the stuff we have on the Japanese and Pacific. And it's interesting because she said, I knew nothing.
Yeah.
They don't teach this, they don't acknowledge it. She just knows nothing.
Yeah.
And the other question I had, which I think you mentioned in 140 Days to Hiroshima, was the nuclear research that the
Yes.
Japanese were doing. They actually were doing nuclear research, and there was a possibility of getting a nuclear bomb.
So they actually had two programs, the Navy and the Army. They weren't nearly as well funded as we were. They, like most of the physics community around the world, knew that there was a possibility of creating a weapon. The Japanese did not believe, neither did the Germans, that it could be created in time to use in the war. The United States had a totally different opinion. They went into it wholeheartedly, beginning really in early 42, and said, we think this is, one, we think the war is going to last a long time, and two, we think we can develop it in time to actually use during the war. The Germans and the Japanese did not believe that it could be done in that period of time. In fact, staying on point for a second, their lead scientist, and I don't remember his name off the top of my head, was sent to Hiroshima after the first bomb to determine whether it was truly a nuclear attack. Yeah, there was a question over here.
You know, my question is basically one of public awareness. And I know that our media would leap on something like this and highlight it to the public. So the question is, how did the people in power, the administration in power, certainly the German administration, how did they keep this under wraps so well so that, you know, most Americans don't know anything about this, and there was no, why was there not any kind of move after we had Nuremberg and the trials to do something similar with the Japanese behaviors?
So you did have war crimes trials, as I mentioned, against the Japanese. How did this one fly under the radar? Probably to some degree in the same way. And back then, actually, I think the government had exercised, at least during World War II, far more control over what the media knew and didn't know. Clearly, if you were buying that, you got to remember, immediately after the war, you had the Cold War starting. And just like we wanted Germany ultimately to become a bulwark against Russia, we wanted Japan in the same way. There was concern or fear that they could become a communist country after the war. They didn't want, obviously, that to happen. And so even though you had the war crimes trials in both these cases, it's not like you wanted to infuriate, so to speak, the local population, I guess, to some degree. That's the only explanation, really, that I can give you in terms of why. The other thing is that Japan has done a really great job, and frankly, we've helped them do it, in my opinion, of claiming victimhood once we attacked them with the atomic bombs. Because they were first of all, they began an aggressive war and they could have bought oil. They decided not to, you know, even after, just as a backup for a quick second, in mid-41, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR had put a iron ore and oil embargo on the Japanese. They were getting 80% of their oil. They had virtually no oil of their own. 93% of their oil was imported and 80% of that was coming from the United States. So when he put the oil embargo on them, that immediately put a pinch on them. The reason that he did it is because they'd been basically fighting in Manchuria and China all the way from 31, but seriously a war since 37. Atrocities like the rape of Nanking had taken place in 37. The Japanese were behaving, we'll say, very badly and had been for years. And it was in an effort using economic effort, in this particular case, to stop them from doing this, is why he did that. Japanese decided that they were going to embark on an aggressive war and attacked us in 1941 instead of stopping what they were doing and continuing anyway, so the Japanese have been doing these kinds of things and had been for quite some time. It just got even larger scale, obviously, once the war really began against us at the end of 41. And that's the reference that I was making when I said in the occupied territories, because they immediately went through basically Southeast Asia, and the Southwest Pacific, took over much of that area in the first 6 months of the war. And in those occupied territories that they held for the bulk of the war, as many as 250,000 people were dying every single month that the war continued.
David, wasn't there also, so to get back to Nellie's question, some of the regard with the relationship with the emperor, MacArthur and the emperor post-war,
right?
In order to kind of keep this information kind of on the down low.
Yeah.
Maybe
So
speak to that.
yeah. So I kind of started down that path, and I got sort of segued away from it. Yeah. So the United States, obviously, because of the Cold War, wanted to have Japan as a bulwark against the Soviet Union as well, and then coupled with, as I started to say that, the Japanese did an excellent job immediately, really after the war was over, of using the atomic bomb to basically shield themselves from the atrocities that they had committed during the course of the war, and the fact that they had been conducting an aggressive war for years and years in in Asia, and we let them essentially get away with it. And they never really, as you pointed out, John, a moment ago, still dealt with it to the degree that we only touched on essentially this, and then, as I said, the atrocities in terms of the occupied territories. But you had comfort women. I don't know if any of you have heard of those. They basically took essentially sex slaves predominantly from Korea, but a lot of the other Asian territories that they were in, the Philippines, and basically turned them into brothels to service the Japanese army over the course of the entire war. In some cases, literally, especially higher-ranking Japanese, literally would have some of these comfort women with them as they were going through commanding a battle, so that they were constantly being serviced. But they were also there to service, the lower levels of the Japanese army. So the Japanese the estimates in China in terms of deaths have risen steadily over the course of the years, and now somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe as many as 15 million Chinese died during the course of the war, many of them due to starvation, disease, exposure, etc. So the Japanese have a very terrible past during the war. Sir, let me get this guy.
I was back at the end of World War I. A lot of the German POWs chose to stay in Japan because they were treated so well. And I didn't understand how it changed so fast. And I read somewhere that, like in the 20s, a lot of the Japanese young men adopted the Bushido warrior, where your power was based on how cruel you could be to everybody around you. And those people made great handlers for the POWs in World War II. They just let them do what they wanted.
Well, actually, if you read the Bushido Code, I talk about this a little bit in my book, the code itself is actually quite honorable if you look at those kinds of things. What the Japanese did is actually kind of took it and used the emperor, and basically in a very perverted way, use it as a way to gain control over the Japanese people and the Japanese military in particular. Because they said, the Japanese looked upon the emperor as a god. in much the same way that Christianity looks upon Jesus, right? And so by using him, and you have a duty to die for the emperor, that it's honorable to die for the emperor. In fact, you should, to live up to that, if you have to die, totally fine to give yourself up for the emperor. It's almost a sin not to do so. So they use that as a way, frankly, to manipulate, to a very large degree, both the civilian and the military population of Japan. The leaders, the real leaders. And the real leaders were the leaders of the military, including the next echelon below the very, we'll say top level, meaning generals kind of thing, who had this attitude of really aggressive imperialism that was to a very large degree, in the case of the Japanese, born out of a feeling of, to some degree, inferiority, but also a concern that they were going to be colonized. All the way back to like when Perry in 1853 came through, the Japanese had this belief that the Western powers were going to colonize Japan. And the only way that they could avoid doing that was to become a military power of their own. There may be validity to doing that, but the reality of it was, in terms of how they actually acted, leading up to what we consider the beginning of World War II, so from 31, 37, all the way up to then 39 and 41, was to behave basically as though they were superior, much like, frankly, the Germans felt. We are superior to everybody else, and we are entitled to do anything we want to anyone else, including, as you just heard today, treat anybody else like they're nothing more than a lab rat. Let me get the guy in the back here say, yeah.
Yes, you said that the U.S. found that the Japanese data was useless?
Yes.
How so? What was useless about it?
I don't know. Yeah. Apparently the way it was conducted was, yeah, it still wasn't valid. I never really pursued, and I don't know whether there was a whole lot in what I was reading, thinking back on it, that ever talked about the specifics of why they found it to be useless, other than it was. Sorry, I can't give you more detail than
Maybe
that.
they didn't want to give the Japanese any credit.
Pardon?
Maybe they didn't want to give the Japanese any credit.
No, I don't think so.
It just may have had no validity, it just may have.
Yeah.
Like you said, just torture for torture.
Documentation.
Yeah, well, so much of it, I mean, the other stuff, obviously, that they did was so much of it was just, well, what can we think of to do to torture somebody today? That's really what an awful lot of this boiled down to, rather than any sort of valid experimentation in any way, shape, or form.
It's common sense that the victim's gonna die.
Yeah.
And that was their goal. I have one quick question. You on the display, or on your program, you showed some dioramas, and it looked like small layouts of
Right.
the plan. Are those located in China?
They are. They are. They have a major museum in Pingfang today. That's what those were. Yeah, unfortunately, they, like the Germans did in many of their camps, destroyed so much of it. Because like I said, if it was the scale of Auschwitz-Birkenau, you just can't see ever any picture today of ruins that are of that scale. And so, yeah, a lot of those are, this is sort of this is a model of what it would have looked like, yeah.
Interesting. And that's, where is Pingfang? Where is that located?
Well, so it'd be northeastern part of, like I say, it's part of Manchuria. So kind of northeastern China. Yeah. I thought there was another question over here, sir? Yes? No? Oh, okay. Anybody?
And true.
Yeah, I was gonna just make one point, and it's a number that stands out in my mind when they talk about POWs, and the fact that the POWs in the European theater suffered a little less than 2% death, and in the Japanese or Pacific theater, the number was 37%.
Yeah.
Which tells you, good heavens.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in fact, I think in my other presentation, a couple of things related to that since you brought it up. In my other presentation about my book, I talk a little bit about that. Yeah, the prisoner of war camps that the Germans had, at least for the Americans and British, big qualification compared to the Russians. Russians, 60% casualty rate, okay? But in case of the Americans and the British, it was about 2%, pretty low overall. And by the way, the Germans didn't have a lot of food, certainly in the latter stages of the war, so a lot of the guys were pretty thin by the end of the war. But nevertheless, that was the mortality rate. In the Pacific, they were treated so poorly by the Japanese that the Allied across the board was about 25. Americans, some were, for some reason, somewhat higher. I thought it was, the number that I recall was more like 33%, so about a third. So a huge difference, order of magnitude higher in the Japanese prisoner of war camps. If I showed you photographs, which I include, like I said, in my other presentation, of what the prisoners looked like when they were liberated at the end of the war, you would have thought I was showing you pictures of the Holocaust victims. They were skin and bones, literally skin and bones. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, I've got 2 points. In conjunction with this gentleman said about prisoners of war, we treated our prisoners of war pretty well.
Very well.
I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania. I'm losing my voice, but there was an army base there in Maryland, Fort Ritchie, and there were, I saw it. Excuse me. Saw a case on TV that I wasn't aware of, but there was a group, they were called the Ritchie Boys.
Jews.
And they were German Jews, spoke fluent German, and they took German prisoners there and, you know, and so didn't torture them. They gave them cigarettes, they fed them well, just talked with them.
Yeah.
And they gleaned a lot of more information than they would have had they been torturing them. I was in the industrial business, and I had 2 customers that were heading up to industrial programs were both German prisoners of war.
Yeah.
And they liked it so well, they stayed here. I got married, became citizens, and good people.
Yeah. Well, according to the Geneva Conventions, you're actually supposed to treat your prisoners of war the same way you treat your own military personnel. Yeah. But we were the only ones that did that.
We did.
Maybe the British did as well, I'm not sure. But most of the German and Italian prisoners of war were brought to the United States, all over the country. Yeah.
Unrelated to this, but in Vietnam, where we were anyway, there were a lot of rats lived in the holes in the ground. And when the monsoons came, the rats came up. And they always told us, don't kill the rats because the rats are infected with fleas that carry bubonic plague. Or if you kill them, make sure you burn them.
Yeah.
And so that was, I didn't know anybody that was actually bitten by fleas that got bubonic plague, but it was something we were very much aware of.
Yeah, that was Ishi's favorite disease, was plague.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
There's a conversation about the fact that where the prison work camp was in Greeley, that at one point during the war, they let them go and visit family and then come back.
They were guests of the families.
Guests of
They would
families.
come for holiday meals.
Yes, they could go out of the prison camp and go, and then come back to the camp.
Oh,
Yeah, we have some great pictures in the home front room upstairs.
okay.
Of German POWs in Greeley worked the fields. They were paid to work the sugar beet fields.
Right.
And you can see that in the picture, there's a tractor and there's probably a dozen German POWs with 2 American military police leaning on their rifles.
Ah. Well, think about it, while we're on that topic. I mean, if you're a German in the United States, how are you possibly going to escape and go anywhere? How could you possibly get back, right? Well, and why? Yeah, frankly, yeah, most of them were, at least, because I've watched a number of programs, frankly, just recently about this. It's like they couldn't believe how they were being treated. The food that they were getting, you know, being outside, being able to exercise, being able to do stuff. They did teach them about democracy and how the United States government or the American government works, stuff like that. But yeah, I've heard a number of stories where a lot of these guys, they did send them back, so they had to make a conscious decision if they were going to attempt to immigrate back into the immigrate into the United States after the war. Yes.
Not many stayed right after.
Right.
They came back.
Right. They had to go that way. Yes, they didn't allow them to stay. I think they were some sort of requirement to actually send them back. Yeah.
And there were a few incidents, like there was, I think a very famous one, it was either in upstate New York or in Canada, where there was a German breakout from a POW camp.
Okay.
But the funniest thing in the world was, you know, as you can imagine, it was pretty much started by a very ardent
Nazi.
probably an SS officer.
Sure.
And he did get, I think it was about 12 or so prisoners of war to follow him along on this escape. But there's a very famous incident where he was asking members of the camp who wanted to escape, and only a tiny handful were willing to. The vast majority were like, no, I'm not escaping.
I read a
Where's
story.
Flint? Is Flint
I
here?
read a story.
Yeah, Flint's up here.
10th Mountain Division, Camp Hale, didn't they use Camp Hale after the 10th Mountain left as a POW
Right,
camp?
right.
Yeah.
It was a POW camp after the 10th left, but there was also an escape attempt there.
I was gonna, yeah.
There was an American soldier, Harvard educated, was kind of a Nazi sympathizer, who was a guard at the camp, and he said he made friends with some of the prisoners, and he said, I'm gonna get you guys out of here. So he got a car and somehow got them out of the enclosure and into the car, and they were headed down to Mexico, and the goal was that they were gonna somehow get passage back to Europe and rejoin the German army. The car broke down in southern New Mexico, or right on the Mexican border, and they were arrested and brought back. And he was actually charged and faced the death penalty, but Truman commuted his sentence.
Oh.
I think he ended up being an insurance salesman in California. His name was Dale Maples,
Huh?
like maple syrup.
Dave, one thing I was ready to touch on, the end of the war, Truman and MacArthur, they were, before the very end of the war, before the Soviets came in, they did not want the Soviets actually at the war crimes trial, for instance, the Japanese. They were actually trying to delay the Soviets coming in because they didn't want to have to deal with the Soviets at the end of the war, just like they did in Berlin, right? And they didn't want to have the Soviets saying, we want part of Japan. And so they delayed it as long as possible, which was successful.
I'm sorry, delayed what?
Delayed Truman, I'm talking about the Potsdam Conference. That's when Russia said, that's when the Soviet Union said, we are going to declare war on, because they had a truce with Japan there, right?
Correct.
And so they were gonna declare war on Japan, and Truman was trying to keep that.
So Stalin actually agreed to that at Yalta in February of 45. It was one of the last official acts of FDR prior to his death on April 12th. So in February of 45, just a couple of months before, he got Stalin's agreement that they would join the war approximately 90 days after the surrender of Germany. Germany surrenders on May 8th, okay, of 45. 90 days later would be August 8th, okay? So they'd gotten his agreement there. One of the things that Truman wanted to do at Potsdam, which is where you're talking about right now, which began around the 17th, I believe it was, of July, continues on into the early part of August. One of the first things he does when he talks to Stalin is he wants him to reiterate or reconfirm that he is going to do that. And he does. He says, we plan to invade. Once the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, they actually sped it up a little bit, not much. They ended up actually invaded on August 9th. They invaded Manchuria, China, not Japan, Manchuria in China. And there's still this thing called water that they would have to cross if they were ever going to invade Japan. And while the Soviet Union was the largest land force by that point in the war, they had no amphibious capability whatsoever. So it's a myth that they could have actually invaded Hokkaido. They actually tried a small incursion into Hokkaido and got their nose bloodied seriously by the Japanese. And that actually took place after the initial surrender announcement, which was on August 15th. That actually took place, I think it was around the 22nd or 23rd of August, where they tried this small incursion up into Hokkaido, and the Japanese fought back and kicked their ass, basically. But there was, so the idea, if you've ever read it in some of these books, that the Japanese were about to invade. In fact, that was the reason for dropping the atomic bomb, was to keep them out of Japan. The idea that they were going to invade or could invade Japan is a myth. They had no ability whatsoever as an amphibious force. The only people that were good at that, for the most part, were the United States, to a lesser degree, the British.
I heard that Truman told Stalin that we had the bomb.
He did. Now, well, and so that was at Potsdam as well. Now, having said that, he didn't say that it was an atomic bomb. He did say that we had a new and very powerful bomb. And Stalin's reaction, because he had spies, believe it or not, down in Los Alamos, he knew about it. And he said, well, I hope you make good use of it, essentially, is what he said, which kind of surprised Truman. And Churchill was within earshot of this, and so he heard it as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we plan to.
Let's take one more question here, and
Yeah.
then we're gonna give David a break, and if you have individual questions you wanna come
Sure.
talk to him after.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of meeting a colonel who was in charge of one of the prisoner of war camps in World War II here. William,
One of ours.
no, it was a German camp. William Kempner was his name.
Okay.
Over there, I guess they call him Colonel Klink.
That was Hogan's Heroes.
Oh, that was a real. I thought that was a documentary.
All right, if you guys
Okay.
give a hand once again to our speaker, David Barrett.
Thank you.
I'm gonna thank you, David. I was gonna ask, do you have one of
I have